Picture the sun setting over the rooftops of Renaissance Florence, casting long shadows across marble palaces where whispered secrets could make or break empires. Behind ornate frescoes and gilded halls, men in silk robes plotted with ink-stained fingers swaying wars, forging alliances and manipulating kings with nothing but their wits. This wasn't just the birthplace of art and culture, it was a battleground of cunning, where city-states no larger than a modern-day county held Europe's fate in their hands. How did places like Venice, Florence, and Milan, tiny dots on the map, become the puppeteers of an entire continent? The answer lies in a web of political intrigue so sharp, it would make even the most ruthless modern strategist pause. Think of these cities as chessboards where every move was a dagger wrapped in velvet. Doges, dukes, and bankers didn't just rule, they schemed. A marriage here, a poisoned cup there, a carefully leaked letter to the right enemy. These weren't just tactics, they were an art form. Florence's Medici family bankrolled popes, while Venice's shadowy council of 10 spied on half of Europe. Milan's Sforza dynasty clawed its way to power through betrayal and battlefield theatrics. But what made these city-states so dangerously effective wasn't just their ruthlessness, it was their ability to turn chaos into order, to wield influence like a scalpel instead of a sword. And that's the real mystery we're unraveling today, how a patchwork of squabbling states, each smaller than a city block, outmaneuvered emperors and kings for centuries. This isn't just a tale of old wars and dusty treaties. It's a masterclass in strategy, a story where art and assassination walked hand in hand, and where the rules of power were rewritten in back alleys and candlelit chambers. By the time we're done, you'll see the Renaissance not just as an age of paintings and poetry, but as the golden era of political gamesmanship, where every smile hit a blade and every handshake could topple a throne. So let's step into the shadows together, where the real drama of history was never written in ink, but in blood and gold. When the Roman Empire crumbled, Europe fractured into a patchwork of warlords and petty kingdoms, but in Italy, something extraordinary happened. Instead of collapsing into chaos, cities like Venice, Genoa, and Florence didn't just survive. They thrived, transforming themselves into economic powerhouses with the cunning of merchants and the ambition of emperors. Cut off from the old imperial system, these city-states became their own masters, answering to no king or pope unless it suited them. What set them apart wasn't just their wealth, though that certainly helped, but how they turned trade routes into lifelines and ledgers into weapons. Take Venice, a swampy archipelago that defied logic by building an empire on salt and shipping. While feudal lords elsewhere fought over farmland, the Venetians mastered the sea, striking deals with Byzantium and the Islamic world that made them the middlemen of continents. Their secret, a republic ruled not by a single tyrant, but by a council of merchant princes who voted with gold as much as voices. Meanwhile, Florence's bankers' families like the Medici realized money could buy more than silk. It could buy loyalty, silence, even the papacy. By inventing double-entry bookkeeping and letters of credit, they turned the city into Europe's first financial capital, where a loan could topple a duke as easily as an army. But power never came without a price. These cities were laboratories of governance, experimenting with systems that would shape modern politics. Some, like Siena, were republics in name but oligarchies in practice, where a handful of elite families pulled the strings. Others, like Milan under the Visconti, swapped republican ideals for the efficiency of a strongman, proving sometimes a dagger in the dark was quicker than a debate. The genius of the Italian city-states wasn't just their flexibility, it was their ruthlessness. They understood that alliances were temporary, treaties were written in disappearing ink, and the only real law was advantage. Yet for all their scheming, these weren't just dens of corruption. They were incubators of ideas, where the clash of interests forced innovation. Venice's complex electoral system, designed to prevent any one family from seizing control, inspired future democracies. Florence's guilds, which gave artisans a voice in government, hinted at the power of collective bargaining centuries before unions. Even their betrayals had a purpose. In a world where trust was currency, the ability to outthink your rival wasn't just survival, it was art. And that's what made these city-states more than just players in history. They were the architects of a new way of thinking, where power wasn't inherited but engineered, one deal, one betrayal, one brilliant gamble at a time. If money was the lifeblood of Renaissance Italy, then Florence's Medici family were its undisputed heart-pumping gold through the veins of Europe, with a cold, calculated precision that turned bankers into kings. Officially, they were merchants. In reality, they were puppet masters, weaving a web of debt, art, and marital alliances so vast that by the time their enemies realized who pulled the strings, it was already too late. The Medici didn't just fund Florence's golden age, they orchestrated it, transforming their ledgers into blueprints for power. Take Cosimo de' Medici, the family's first true architect of influence. He understood something revolutionary. In a city that hated the word tyrant, the safest throne was one nobody saw. Instead of seizing power outright, he bankrolled it, loaning staggering sums to popes, kings, and even rival Florentine families, then calling in favors when votes needed swaying. His palazzo wasn't just a home. It was a nerve center where artists like Donatello rubbed shoulders with politicians, all subtly reminded of who paid their bills. And when his rivals finally exiled him, Florence's economy crumbled within months, forcing them to beg him back, a masterclass in soft power. But it was Lorenzo, his grandson, who perfected the game. Known as the Magnificent, he ruled Florence without ever holding office, his influence dripping from every fresco, every marriage contract, every well-placed whisper. He turned art into propaganda, commissioning Botticelli and Michelangelo to paint the city's walls, with Medici-funded glory making dissent seem not just treasonous, but tasteless. Meanwhile, his sister married a pope's son, his daughter a duke, binding Italy's elite to the family in gilded chains. Even his enemies admitted his genius. When the Pazzi family tried to murder him during Mass, Lorenzo survived by sheer tactical brilliance, hiding in a cathedral sacristy, while his allies rounded up the conspirators and hanged them from the palazzo windows. The Medici's true innovation wasn't their ruthlessness, though. It was their veneer of benevolence. By posing as patrons rather than princes, they made Florence believe its brilliance was its own, when in reality, every scholarship, every public festival, even the city's famed Republican debates were carefully staged to keep the family indispensable. Their downfall came only when they forgot their own rule. Real power stays invisible. The moment a Medici dared to call himself Duke, Florence revolted. But by then, their legacy was etched in stone and in the silent, smiling arithmetic of every backroom deal that still defines politics today. While Florence played politics with gold and art, Venice operated in shadows. Its greatness built not just on trade, but on an intricate machine of surveillance and silent terror. The so-called Serene Republic was anything but peaceful beneath its glittering canals. Behind those ornate masks of carnival wasn't just revelry. They were the perfect disguise for a government that ruled through whispered threats and ink-stained dossiers. At its heart, the Council of Ten, a cabal of anonymous patricians who could condemn a man to drowning with a nod. Their meetings held in a chamber whose walls were said to echo with the screams of the interrogated. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was psychological warfare. Venice's spies, known as the Inquisitors of State, infiltrated every corner of Europe, from Constantinople's bazaars to Rome's papal chambers. Their reports read like thrillers: merchants bribed to drop careless secrets, courtesans trained to loosen tongues with wine and velvet laughter, even priests persuaded to break the seal of confession. One particularly bold operative, a woman known only as La Veneziana, allegedly seduced a French ambassador into revealing military plans, only to have his body found floating in the Grand Canal days later. The message was clear: cross Venice, and the water would swallow you whole. But the council's true genius was its illusion of fairness. Trials were swift, sentences brutal, yet always wrapped in legal theatrics. Deniability was their art form. When Doge Francesco Foscari dared to mourn his exiled son too publicly, the Ten didn't just remove him. They staged his resignation like a tragic play, forcing the old man to strip off his ducal robes piece by piece as the bell of St. Mark's told, even suicide offered no escape. After Admiral Vetter Pisani hanged himself in prison, the Ten ordered his corpse tried posthumously, then dragged through the streets as a lesson. Yet for all its cruelty, Venice's system worked with chilling efficiency. While other states collapsed into civil war, the Republic lasted centuries because fear kept ambition in check. No family could grow too powerful, not when every servant might be an informant, every love letter a death warrant. Even the famed Venetian arsenal wasn't just a shipyard. It was a meticulously controlled ecosystem where workers were paid well, but watched relentlessly, ensuring no single trade secret ever slipped beyond the lagoon. What's most haunting isn't the brutality, but the precision. Venice proved that power didn't need thrones or crowns, just information, ruthlessness, and the willingness to let the tides erase your mistakes. Modern intelligence agencies still study their methods, because in the end, the Serene Republic's darkest secret wasn't its violence. It was how calmly, how beautifully, it made terror look like governance. Milan's streets ran red with ambition long before the Renaissance painted its golden veneer over Italy. While Florence dazzled with banking and Venice lurked in shadows, the Dukes of Milan played a far deadlier game, one where power wasn't just bought or spied upon, but seized by the blade. The Visconti family didn't rise to dominance. They clawed their way up, leaving a trail of poisoned chalices and broken oaths in their wake. Their emblem, a viper swallowing a child, wasn't just a crest, it was a warning. Start with Gian Galeazzo Visconti, the serpent who nearly swallowed Italy whole. He didn't conquer cities. He bought their loyalty, then strangled them with their own greed. When his uncle Bernabo ruled jointly with him, Gian Galeazzo didn't wait for inheritance. He invited Bernabo to a peace meeting, served him wine laced with poison, then locked his choking uncle in a castle dungeon to die. With that single act, Milan became his chessboard, and he moved armies like pawns, hiring mercenaries not for battles, but for terror. His condottieri didn't just fight. They staged massacres so gruesome, neighboring cities surrendered at the rumor of their approach. Yet Gian Galeazzo's masterpiece was his marriage market. He wed his daughter to the Duke of Bavaria's son, his niece to the King of England's brother, weaving a web of alliances that stretched from Paris to Constantinople. For a moment, it seemed he'd crown himself king of a united Italy until fate struck him down with fever at the height of his power. Some whispered it wasn't illness, but a rival's slow-acting poison. A fitting end for a man who'd made betrayal his religion. Enter the Sforzas, the dynasty built on sheer audacity. Francesco Sforza, a mercenary captain with no noble blood, dared to marry Gian Galeazzo's illegitimate daughter, then turned his own army against Milan when the city tried to stiff his pay. His siege wasn't just warfare, it was theater. Starving citizens watched as Sforza's men paraded outside the walls, roasting oxen on spits while Milan's children begged for crusts. When the city finally surrendered, Francesco didn't take the throne. He made the council offer it to him, preserving the illusion of republican consent. But the Sforza's real innovation was turning violence into spectacle. Ludovico, nicknamed the Moor, staged elaborate feasts where courtiers whispered about which guest might disappear next. He commissioned Leonardo da Vinci not just for art, but for war machines, giant crossbows, portable bridges, while his wife Beatrice ruled Milan's glittering court, her gowns stitched with gems to blind rivals to the daggers beneath. When French invaders finally toppled them, it wasn't because Milan grew weak. It was because Ludovico, in a rare misstep, underestimated how deep his own mercenaries' greed ran. What's chilling isn't their cruelty, but their calculation. The Visconti and Sforza dukes knew something modern dictators grasp. Fear works best when gilded. Their courts dripped with art, their laws spoke of justice, but their rule. That was carved in the bones of those who learned too late in Milan. You didn't cross the dragon. You became its supper. Behind the gilded altars of Vatican City, the Renaissance papacy ran not on prayer, but on poison, and no family mastered that unholy alchemy better than the Borgias. When Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, he didn't just inherit the keys to heaven. He seized control of Italy's most ruthless political machine. This wasn't spirituality, it was a dynasty dressed in vestments, where cardinals plotted like warlords and confessionals doubled as spy nests. Alexander's rise was itself a masterpiece of corruption. To secure the papal tiara, he didn't just bribe fellow cardinals. He promised their sons duchies, their nieces dowries, even emptying the Vatican treasury to buy votes. His rival Cardinal Della Rover, future Pope Julius II, spat that the conclave smelled like a butcher's shop from the stench of backroom deals. Once crowned, Alexander turned the Holy See into a family enterprise. His son Cesare, a cardinal at 18 despite church laws, became his enforcer, trading his robes for armor to carve out a Borgia kingdom in central Italy. Meanwhile, daughter Lucrezia's marriages were less unions than land grabs. When her first husband became inconvenient, rumors swirled he'd been murdered by Borgia assassins. But the true scandal wasn't their cruelty, it was their brazenness. Alexander hosted orgies in the Apostolic Palace, then next morning pardoned killers for cash to fund Cesare's wars. He manipulated the Jubilee year pilgrimage, funneling millions in Chinese letter donations into his private coffers. When a critic pinned verses mocking him to the statue of Pasquino, Alexander had the man's tongue cut out, then displayed the severed flesh on a spike outside St. Peter's. Yet the Borgias also grasped a hard truth. In a fractured Italy, only the papacy had the reach to unite the peninsula. Cesare's conquests weren't just for power. They were a blueprint for Italian unification centuries early. Their methods were monstrous, but their vision was chillingly modern, proving that in Renaissance politics, even the holiest office could be weaponized. When Alexander died suddenly in 1503, likely from poisoned wine meant for someone else, Rome erupted in riots. But the real shock wasn't his death. It was how seamlessly the next pope, Julius II, adopted his playbook, trading Borgia daggers for artillery to wage wars in the name of God. The lesson: in an age where faith and power shared a throne, salvation took a backseat to survival, and even saints had to get their hands dirty. History remembers the Borgias as the original crime family, their name synonymous with poison, incest, and sacrilege, but how much of their infamy is truth, and how much is propaganda spun by terrified rivals? Start with Cesare, the golden boy turned butcher. Contemporary portraits show him in black velvet, his dagger always within reach, but his real weapon was sheer audacity. After resigning as cardinal, a title his father bought him at 17, he carved a personal kingdom from Italy's chaos. His tactics: part Machiavelli, part mafia boss. When mercenary captains hesitated to join him, he invited them to a banquet at Sinigalia, then had his men strangle them mid-meal. Yet for all his brutality, Cesare was also a visionary. His campaigns in the Romagna weren't just land grabs, they centralized power, crushed petty warlords, and laid groundwork for modern states. The irony. Machiavelli himself called Cesare the ideal prince, while Florence secretly funded his enemies. Then there's Lucrezia, the so-called poison maiden. Gossip claimed she wore a hollow ring to drip arsenic into wine, but ledgers tell a different story. Vatican accounts show she governed Spoleto at 19, mediating disputes with startling fairness. The Borgia incest rumors likely stemmed from her father annulling her first marriage by claiming she'd slept with him, a legal fiction to secure a better political match. Her real sin wasn't poison, it was surviving in a world that demanded monsters of its women. When her third husband, the Duke of Ferrara, brought her to his court, nobles expected a Medea. Instead, they got a patron of poets who turned Ferrara into a cultural beacon. The Borgia's darkest truth: they were hardly worse than their peers, just better at performance. Alexander's predecessor, Innocent VIII, sold indulgences to fund his son's wedding. The next pope, Julius II, led armies in person while commissioning Michelangelo. What made the Borgias infamous wasn't their crimes, but their lack of shame. When Alexander wanted to silence critic Giovanni Michiel, he didn't bother with subtlety. The man's corpse was found stuffed in a chest, skin peeling from what was almost certainly Cantarella, the family's signature poison. That chest became their legacy, gorgeous on the outside, rotting within. Modern forensics suggests even their signature poison might be myth. Cantarella likely didn't exist. Renaissance chroniclers used the term for any unexplained death. The real Borgia poison was information. Alexander's spies intercepted letters across Europe, using secrets to blackmail cardinals into obedience. Their downfall came when they misjudged the power of perception. After Alexander's suspicious death, enemies torched his secretary's archives, ensuring history would remember only the horror stories. Perhaps the greatest Borgia deception is that we still debate them 5 centuries later. Were they demons, or just the first to realize that in politics, reputation is mightier than any blade? Either way, their true poison wasn't in rings or wine. It was the lesson that power, unchecked by even the pretense of virtue, corrupts absolutely. And that's a toxin no antidote can cure. The knife flashed during Mass, a sacred moment turned slaughterhouse. On April 26, 1478, as the priest elevated the Eucharist in Florence's cathedral, assassins lunged at Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano. Blades struck 17 times. Giuliano fell, his body nearly carved apart, but Lorenzo, wounded yet quick-witted, fought his way to the sacristy and barred the door. This wasn't just murder. It was a meticulously staged coup, the infamous Pazzi conspiracy, where banking rivals and a scorned archbishop bet everything on one violent gambit: kill the Medici brothers mid-prayer, and Florence would rise in revolt against their rule. The plotters miscalculated fatally. They'd studied the when and where, but not the why of Florentine loyalty. As Giuliano's blood pooled on the cathedral floor, the crowd didn't cheer, they rioted. Lorenzo emerged hours later to a city already hunting his would-be killers. Francesco de' Pazzi, who'd stabbed Giuliano so ferociously he wounded his own thigh, was dragged from hiding and hanged beside the archbishop from the Palazzo della Signoria's windows. Their corpses swung for days, a grisly billboard of Medici vengeance. What's chilling isn't the violence, but the cold calculus behind it. The Pazzi family didn't act alone. Pope Sixtus IV, itching to curb Medici influence, had blessed the plot. His nephew Girolamo Riario supplied assassins. Even King Ferrante of Naples, wary of Florence's growing power, tacitly approved. This was politics stripped bare. No treaties, no tariffs, just steel and the belief that removing 2 men could collapse an entire regime. The conspirators forgot one rule: terror only works if the target dies. Lorenzo turned survival into spectacle. He ordered the conspirators' bodies left to rot publicly, then spun the attack into myth. Artists depicted him as Florence's savior. Poets compared him to ancient martyrs. Within weeks, he'd purged the Pazzi name from records, seized their estates, and even banned their emblem. A far crueler fate than execution in a society where memory meant immortality. Nor was this an outlier. In Milan, Duke Galeazzo Maria Sforza fell to 3 daggers in church on St. Stephen's Day, his killers shouting, "Death to the tyrant." Before the altar, Venice's Council of 10 once sentenced a treasonous noble to have his hand cut off, tongue ripped out, and eyes gouged, all before hanging him between the columns of the Piazzetta. These weren't crimes of passion. They were message-sending, calibrated to shock allies into obedience and rivals into retreat. The genius of Renaissance assassinations lay in their theatricality. A death in private solved nothing. The power came from the performance. When Cesare Borgia wanted to silence a talkative condottiero, he didn't hire a lone knife man. He had the man strangled at a banquet, ensuring every guest saw the consequence of disloyalty. In an age without mass media, bloodshed was the headline, and the message was always the same: cross the wrong patron, and even God won't save you. Yet for all their planning, plotters often overlooked a fatal flaw. Killing a leader didn't dismantle their machine, it galvanized it. After Lorenzo's near murder, Florence rallied behind him tighter than ever. When the Sforza Duke perished, his brother stepped smoothly into the void. These city-states weren't kingdoms reliant on a single crown. They were networks, resilient as spider silk. Remove one thread, and the web only shuddered, then tightened around the next heir, the next banker, the next shadow in the council chamber. Assassination wasn't the end game. It was the opening move in a far deadlier match, where the dead were merely pawns, and the real players never showed their faces. In Renaissance Italy, a treaty wasn't a promise, it was a pause. City-states like Venice, Florence, and Milan wielded parchment and wax seals like weapons, signing alliances with one hand while the other hovered over a dagger. The greatest trick these rulers perfected, making betrayal look like statecraft. Take the Treaty of Lodi in 1454, a masterpiece of temporary peace. On paper, it united Milan, Venice, and Florence against foreign invaders. In reality, It was a ticking clock, each signatory counting down to when they could stab their allies in the back with minimal fallout. Marriages were the ultimate sleight of hand. When Ludovico Sforza wed his niece to the Holy Roman Emperor's nephew, the dowry wasn't just gold. It was the promise of Milanese troops in future wars. Yet within months, Ludovico was secretly funding French claims to Naples, betting against his own in-laws. The Venetians elevated this to high art. Their brides traveled with chests of jewels and spies, instructed to whisper palace secrets back to the Doge's council. One such bride, Caterina Cornaro, became Queen of Cyprus through marriage only for Venice to console her widowhood by annexing her kingdom. No bloodshed required. But the true genius lay in the loopholes. Treaties were drafted with deliberate ambiguity, clauses vague enough to deny violations later. After the Peace of Bagnolo ended the War of Ferrara in 1484, Venice celebrated publicly, while quietly moving troops into disputed territories, arguing the treaty's wording permitted defensive garrisons. Pope Alexander VI took it further, issuing papal bulls that nullified treaties overnight, citing divine intervention. The fragility of these accords wasn't a flaw, it was the point. Like a merchant counting coins, every ruler knew alliances had expiration dates. When Florence betrayed Milan in 1494 by siding with France, it wasn't treachery, just good business. The Treaty of Lodi's collapse proved it. In Italy, peace was just war by other means, and the only real law was knowing when to fold your hand. Venetian spies didn't just gather secrets, they weaponized silence. At the heart of the Doge's palace lay the Camera, the Black Chamber, where intercepted letters arrived by the dozen, their wax seals steamed open with meticulous care before being copied, resealed, and sent onward as if untouched. This wasn't just mail tampering, it was psychological warfare, designed to make every ambassador wonder if his most private words were already in the Council of Ten's hands. The Chamber's cryptographers, some of Europe's finest, cracked codes with tools more precise than lockpicks, frequency analysis, cipher wheels, even custom dictionaries of common diplomatic phrases. One decrypted letter from the Ottoman court revealed plans to bribe a Venetian admiral, a revelation that led to the admiral's accidental drowning days later. But Venice's real brilliance was in its hierarchy of secrecy. At the top, the Inquisitori di Stato operated with near-mythical discretion, their identities hidden behind black hoods during meetings. Below them, a network of Esburi informants infiltrated every tavern and brothel, while polygraphy code specialists concocted unbreakable ciphers for Venetian ambassadors. Even the humble scrivani, public letter writers in Piazza San Marco, were trained to memorize suspicious phrases and report back. The system was so thorough that when the French ambassador once boasted his correspondence was secure, Venice leaked his own decrypted love letters to his mistress, a not-so-subtle reminder that no secret was safe. Florence played the game differently. The Medici employed tornatori, specialists who crafted hollowed-out statues, false-bottomed chests, even Bibles with hidden compartments to smuggle messages. Their most infamous agent, Sister Benedetta Carlini, posed as a mystic nun, using her confessional access to extract secrets from noblewomen. Meanwhile, Milan's Sforza dynasty preferred brute force espionage. Their famigliari were essentially legalized assassins, licensed to kidnap or kill enemies abroad. One operative famously intercepted a courier from Naples, switched his dispatches with forgeries, then strangled him and staged the body as a robbery victim, all to provoke a war between Milan's rivals without leaving fingerprints. Codes themselves became art forms. The Vatican's papal ciphers substituted letters with saints' names, turning a simple note into a prayer that only the intended cleric could decode. Lucrezia Borgia allegedly sent her father Pope Alexander the sixth letters written in lemon juice, invisible until heated, a trick learned from Moorish spies. The most elaborate system belonged to Venice's Libro d'Oro cipher, which changed monthly and required a keyword known only to the Doge and his inner circle. When a French cryptographer finally cracked it after 6 months, the Council of Ten didn't just change the code, they fed him false intelligence that led France into a humiliating naval defeat. What made Renaissance espionage so deadly wasn't just the tools, but the theater. Spies were trained in sprezzatura, the art of making calculated moves look effortless. A Venetian agent might accidentally spill wine on a target to steal their purse during the apology. Florentine bankers planted rumors in ledger margins, knowing rivals would snoop. And when the Duke of Urbino suspected a servant was a double agent, he didn't execute him, he had the man's wages paid in counterfeit coins, then arrested him for fraud to avoid political blowback. Every act, from a slit throat to a forged signature, was staged for maximum deniability. Yet the greatest trick these city-states pulled was convincing Europe that their power came from God or gold, not from the invisible army of cipher-breakers, poison mixers, and honey-tongued informants who truly ruled from the shadows. Because in the end, the Renaissance wasn't just painted in frescoes and sonnets. It was written in blood, ink, and the silent language of betrayal only those in the Black Chamber could read. Gold flowed thicker than blood in Renaissance Europe, and no one understood this better than the Medici and Fugger banking dynasty's families, who realized early that controlling a kingdom's purse strings meant controlling its fate. Forget crowns and armies, the real power lay in ledgers, where a well-placed loan could topple a throne or launch a crusade. When Cosimo de' Medici bankrolled Pope John XXIII's election in 1415, he didn't just earn divine favor, he bought a seat at the table where empires were carved up. The Vatican's debts became Florence's leverage, turning papal bulls into Medici mandates. Jakob Fugger, the Augsburg banker who funded emperors, took it further. His motto, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry," wasn't just advice. It was strategy. When Charles V needed cash to bribe electors for the Holy Roman Emperor title in 1519, Fugger fronted the staggering sum of 852,000 florins, equivalent to today's billions. The contract didn't just demand interest. It stipulated imperial monopolies on mercury and silver mines, effectively making Fugger the treasury of Europe's mightiest empire. His agents sat in royal councils, his couriers outran king's messengers, and his black books listed which monarchs were one missed payment away from collapse. Bankers didn't just fund wars, they orchestrated them. The Medici's branches in Lyon and Bruges became clearinghouses for intrigue, where a withdrawal could incite rebellion. In 1480, Lorenzo de' Medici froze the account of Naples' King Ferrante, strangling his military peril mid-campaign. The result, Naples sued for peace within months. Fugger played both sides of the Reformation, loaning to Catholic Charles V while secretly funding Protestant princes and ensuring whoever won, his debts would be honored. But their true innovation was debt as a weapon. When Venice hesitated to repay loans, the Medici accidentally leaked their delinquency to rival states, sparking a credit crisis that collapsed Venetian bond prices. Fugger perfected the hostile takeover. When Duke Sigismund of Austria defaulted, Fugger seized his Tyrolean silver mines, becoming the continent's largest bullion producer overnight. These weren't just transactions, they were coups without swords, where balance sheets held more terror than battalions. What's chilling isn't their ruthlessness, but their foresight. They invented financial instruments we still use today, letters of credit, to move money across borders without physical gold, futures contracts to bet on war's outcomes, even early forms of insurance to protect shipments of stolen relics. The Medici's Monte del Dote, a state-backed dowry fund, wasn't just philanthropy. It bound Florence's elite to their bank through generations of marital debt. Yet their downfall came from the same vice they exploited in others, overreach. When the Medici backed the wrong French claimant in 1494, their Leon branch collapsed under unpaid loans. Fugger's heirs, drowning in Habsburg defaults, learned too late that even kings can't spend what they can't repay. The lesson: money could buy thrones, but not loyalty, and in the end, the bankers who made kings found their own names scribbled in the margins of history's ledger, right beside the debts no one intended to pay. On the battlefields of Renaissance Italy, honor died the moment gold changed hands. At the heart of every war stood the condottieri, mercenary captains, who treated armies like commodities and loyalty like a line item in their ledgers. These weren't soldiers, they were entrepreneurs in armor, men who could turn the tide of a battle not with courage, but with a carefully timed betrayal. Take Francesco Sforza, the peasant's son who parlayed his sword into a dukedom. One day he'd be fighting for Milan, the next against it, not out of principle, but because Venice offered a fatter purse and a prettier title. His contract with Florence included a clause allowing him to abandon the campaign if his pay was even one day late. The system was designed for deceit. Condottieri contracts, some surviving in archives, read like modern corporate mergers, pages of loopholes guaranteeing commanders could switch sides if their employer faltered. During the Battle of Anghiari in 1440, rival mercenary bands fought so half-heartedly that chroniclers noted only one death: a soldier who fell off his horse and drowned in a ditch. Why risk lives when both sides were just auditioning for future employers? The infamous Sir John Hawkwood, an Englishman who became Italy's most feared condottiero, painted his helmet with alternating black and white stripes, a not-so-subtle reminder that he'd fight for either side, depending on the bid. But the true genius of these warlords lay in their deception. Federigo da Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino, always led charges with his right side forward, not for bravery, but because his left eye was missing, making his blind spot a deadly trap for attackers. The Venetian condottiero Bartolomeo Colleoni staged mock battles with his own troops to impress potential clients, then pocketed their recruitment fees without ever facing real combat. And when the mercenary Carmagnola suspected Venice was about to dismiss him, he preemptively sold military secrets to Milan only to be lured back to Venice for a victory banquet, where the Doge's guards stabbed him to death mid-feast. What's most startling isn't their treachery, but their lasting influence. These men essentially invented modern military contracting, the notion that war could be outsourced to the highest bidder. Their legacy echoes in today's private armies and corporate security firms, where loyalty still has a price tag. The difference: Renaissance mercenaries didn't bother with PR spin. They knew the game for what it was: violence as a service, where the only real oath was to the coin. Beneath the sparkling waters of the Mediterranean lay a battlefield without borders, where Venetian galleys and Genoese carracks clashed not just with cannons, but with ledgers, bribes, and whispered sabotage. This wasn't just a rivalry, it was a 400-year game of maritime chess, where every trade route was a contested square, and every port a potential massacre waiting to happen. The opening move came in 1258, when a Genoese merchant stabbed a Venetian sailor over a dockside insult in Acre. What should have been a tavern brawl spiraled into the War of St. Sabas, a conflict so petty in origin, so brutal in execution, that it set the tone for centuries of vendetta. Venetian mobs raised Genoa's quarter in Constantinople, while Genoese pirates strung up Venetian captains from their own yardarms, but the real war wasn't fought with swords. It was waged in the silent spaces between transactions, where a single manipulated ledger could bankrupt a rival's fleet. Take the Battle of Curzola in 1298. On the surface, it looked like another naval slugfest, Genoa's Admiral Lambi Doria crushing Venice's fleet, capturing Admiral Marco Polo's own son along with thousands of sailors. But dig deeper, and you'll find the real dagger twist. Genoa didn't just imprison those Venetians. They shipped them to their colony in Caffa, forcing them to weave silk for Genoese merchants, turning military victory into economic enslavement. Venice retaliated by slapping embargoes on Genoese goods, then bribing Mongol warlords to sack Genoa's Black Sea ports. This was warfare by proxy, where the battlefield stretched from the Adriatic to the Caspian, and the deadliest weapons were tariffs and trade permits. The 14th century saw the rivalry metastasize into something darker: state-sponsored piracy wrapped in legal loopholes. Venice's Senate secretly issued letters of marque to privateers, granting them immunity to plunder Genoese ships as long as the Doge got his 20% cut. Genoa responded with the Mahona, a shadowy syndicate of bankers and corsairs who funded pirate fleets through what we now call venture capital. Their most infamous captain, Simone Vignoso, didn't just seize Venetian spice ships. He sold their cargo at auction in Genoa, then loaned the profits back to Venice's enemies at crippling interest rates. Espionage became as vital as naval power. Venetian agents infiltrated Genoa's dockyards, bribing shipwrights to weaken hull timbers with rotten wood. Genoese spies poisoned Venetian well teams in Crete, sabotaging the colony's water supply. One surviving ledger from 1382 reveals Venice paid a Genoese galley slave to accidentally drop a lantern in his ship's powder magazine, an early form of insider terrorism. The most brazen operation, when Genoa convinced Venice's ally Byzantium to massacre thousands of Venetians in Constantinople in 1281, Venice spent decades plotting revenge, finally achieving it by bankrolling the Ottoman siege that doomed the Byzantine Empire itself. By the 15th century, the conflict had birthed something unrecognizable to medieval knights: corporate warfare. The Genos Banco di San Giorgio, Europe's first modern corporation, literally colonized Corsica as a business venture to strangle Venetian trade routes. Venice's state-run arsenal, countered by mass-producing standardized warships like a Renaissance assembly line. Both sides hired Albanian mercenaries to stage false flag attacks, each blaming the other to justify blockades. The death blow came not from battle, but from balance sheets when Genoa's overextension in colonial ventures bankrupted its treasury, leaving Venice to dominate Mediterranean trade by default. What makes this feud so mesmerizing isn't the bloodshed, but the sophistication. These weren't barbarians raiding coasts. They were proto-capitalists, wielding economic hit jobs centuries before the term existed. Their tactics, embargoes as weapons, debt as leverage, information as currency, feel chillingly modern. The real lesson: in the shadow wars of commerce, the victor isn't always the one with the biggest fleet, but the one who plays the longest game. And Venice, with its patient, centuries-long vendetta, proved even the mightiest empire could be bled dry by 1,000 paper cuts. The Arno River ran red long before it reflected Florence's golden sunsets, because for 2 centuries, its waters divided not just lands, but bitter enemies locked in a death grip. Florence and Pisa's feud wasn't just between cities, it was a clash of identities. Florence, landlocked and proud, saw itself as the heir to Rome's intellectual legacy. Pisa, with its seafaring might, scoffed at these pretensions while counting coins from Mediterranean trade. Their battles weren't fought over mere territory, they were duels over destiny, where control of trade routes meant controlling the future of Tuscany itself. It began with salt and silk. In the 12th century, Pisa's ships dominated the western Mediterranean, their merchants trading Tunisian grain and Syrian spices, while Florence's wool merchants bristled at paying Pisan tariffs. When Pisa blocked Florentine goods from its port in 1171, Florence retaliated by bankrolling Pisa's inland rivals Lucca, Siena to strangle Pisan supply lines. The conflict escalated from ledgers to battlefields when Florence convinced Emperor Henry VI to revoke Pisa's imperial privileges, a masterstroke of political sabotage. But Pisa struck back with naval raids up the Arno, burning Florentine warehouses while their galleys blockaded the river mouth. The turning point came at the Battle of Monteperti in 1260. Though chiefly remembered for Siena's triumph over Florence, Pisa's role was decisive. Their crossbowmen, hired as mercenaries, slaughtered thousands of Florentine troops, leaving the city so vulnerable that its leaders debated surrendering to Pisa outright. Florentine chroniclers would later call this their darkest hour, but it was also the birth of their ruthlessness. Over the next 50 years, Florence turned economic warfare into an art form. They diverted the Arno's tributaries to silt up Pisa's harbor, funded Genoa to cripple Pisan shipping, and even bribed the Pope to excommunicate Pisa's leaders during critical trade negotiations. Pisa's final undoing came from within. After a disastrous war with Genoa in 1284 left their fleet in ruins, Florence pounced. They didn't send armies first, they sent bankers, buying up Pisan debt until the city's treasury was a Medici puppet show. By 1406, when Florentine troops finally marched into Pisa, the siege was almost ceremonial. The real conquest had happened decades earlier in shadowy backrooms where gold proved mightier than gunpowder. Yet Florence's vengeance had a twist. Rather than razing Pisa, they made it a trophy. They rebuilt its cathedral square, not out of mercy, but to showcase Florentine dominance. Even Galileo, Pisa's greatest son, would be co-opted into Florence's narrative, his breakthroughs claimed as Medici-sponsored genius. The lesson: in Renaissance Tuscany, true victory wasn't just breaking your enemy, it was rewriting history to make their legacy your own. Siena's cobblestone streets hid more than just medieval charm, they concealed a viper's nest of rival clans whose feuds would prove fatal. For generations, the city had balanced precariously between two powerful factions. The Novskai, wealthy merchants who controlled trade, and the Reformatori, populist reformers backed by artisans. This delicate tension collapsed in 1480 when the Novskai made a desperate gamble, inviting Charles VIII of France to mediate their disputes as he marched toward Naples. What they envisioned as a temporary alliance became a death sentence. The French king's troops didn't just pass through Siena, they occupied it, draining its treasury and shattering its autonomy while Florentine agents circled like vultures. The Reformatori saw their chance. Convinced the Novskai had sold the city to foreigners, they turned traitor themselves, secretly negotiating with Florence's Piero de' Medici to overthrow their own government. Their betrayal unfolded with cinematic precision. During a chaotic council meeting, Reformatory leaders flung open the Palazzo Pubblico's gates to Florentine troops, while French garrisons were distracted by staged riots. By nightfall, Siena's iconic black and white crest was being torn down from public buildings, yet the cruelest twist was still to come. Florence, posing as Siena's protector, imposed a puppet regime while systematically dismantling its institutions. They banned Sienese merchants from foreign trade, transferred the lucrative wool guild's operations to Florence, and even relocated the University of Siena's most prestigious scholars north. But the real masterpiece of subversion was economic. Florentine bankers bought up Siena's war debts at pennies on the dollar, then called them due simultaneously, a financial blitzkrieg that bankrupted the city within months. When desperate Sienese nobles begged Emperor Charles V for help in 1552, Florence revealed its final move. It had already bribed the imperial commissioners sent to investigate. The subsequent treaty didn't just strip Siena's independence, it erased the city's name from official documents, referring to it only as Florence's southern territories. What makes Siena's fall so haunting isn't the conquest itself, it's how thoroughly its own elites enabled it. The Novskai, fearing democracy more than foreign rule, had invited the wolf into the sheepfold. The Reformatori, blinded by revenge, failed to see they were just trading one master for another. Even the artisans who cheered Florence's arrival soon found their workshops shuttered, their wages halved. In the end, Siena became the ultimate cautionary tale. A city so busy fighting itself, it never noticed the noose tightening until it was too late to struggle. Today, its stunning Piazza del Campo still draws tourists, but few realize they're walking through a monument to the oldest lesson of all: divide and be conquered. Naples was less a kingdom than a carcass over which wolves circled Angevins and Aragonese tearing at its throat, while popes blessed the feast and barons sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. This wasn't just a war of succession, it was a free-for-all where dynasties, duchies, and even pirate captains carved slices from a crumbling state. The conflict began in 1282 with the Sicilian Vespers, that infamous Easter Monday massacre where Sicilians slaughtered thousands of French Angevin troops, sparking a 20-year war. But Naples became the prize neither side could fully claim, its crown bouncing between Angevin pretenders and Aragonese interlopers like a gold coin tossed in a tavern brawl. Take Joanna I, the queen whose reign read like a tragedy penned by Machiavelli. Inheriting the throne at 17, she survived 4 husbands, multiple papal excommunications, and a Hungarian invasion only to be strangled with a silk cord by her own cousin. Her crime, switching alliances too often, first backing the Avignon papacy, then flirting with Rome, while her barons played both sides like a rigged card game. The papacy didn't just meddle, it monetized the chaos. Popes sold Naples as a fiefdom to whichever faction promised the fattest tithes, turning spiritual authority into a real estate hustle. Meanwhile, the barons perfected the art of betrayal. The Caracciolo family famously hosted lavish dinners for both Angevin and Aragonese generals in the same week, while secretly auctioning their military secrets to the highest bidder. One chronicler recounts how the Count of Cassardie changed allegiance mid-battle, his knights swapping their surcoats from Angevin lilies to Aragonese stripes as they wheeled to attack their former allies. Foreign powers treated Naples as an open market. The Hungarians invaded under Louis the Great, citing some tenuous familial claim, while Catalan mercenaries roamed the countryside like armed tax collectors. Even the Albanian warlord Skanderbeg sent troops, not for conquest, but to extort payments from both sides to avoid joining the war. The chaos birthed grotesque innovations. When Alfonso V of Aragon finally seized Naples in 1442, he didn't just execute his rivals. He taxidermied their bodies and displayed them in the Castel Nuovo's throne room as a macabre lesson in loyalty. Yet his victory proved hollow. Within decades, the French were back, the barons revolting, and the papacy stirring the pot anew. Naples' tragedy wasn't its conquests, but its uncanny ability to make every victor's triumph feel temporary. Because in this kingdom of shadows, power wasn't taken, it was leased, with interest paid in blood. Ferrara's Este family didn't conquer Italy, they charmed it. While their neighbors waged wars and staged coups, the Este rulers built their dynasty on subtler weapons, wedding vows and poetry. Nestled between Venice's spies and Florence's bankers, Ferrara could have been crushed like an eggshell. Instead, the Este turned their city into a cultural fortress, where a sonnet could secure more than 1,000 swords. Take Niccolo III, who juggled 20 mistresses yet brokered the marriage of his illegitimate son Ugo to the daughter of Milan's fearsome Visconti swapping scandal for legitimacy in one shrewd move. Their true genius lay in playing patrons, not warlords. When Leonello d'Este inherited Ferrara in 1441, he didn't raise taxes or conscript armies. He commissioned illuminated manuscripts and hosted philosophers. His library became a diplomatic hub, where rival ambassadors debated Plauto instead of border disputes. By the time his sister Bianchi married Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III, Ferrara's influence stretched from the Po River to Vienna, all without firing a single cannon. The masterpiece of Este statecraft was Lucrezia Borgia's marriage to Alfonso d'Este in 1502. On paper, it was a disaster waiting to happen, the Pope's infamous daughter joining a family allergic to scandal. But Alfonso saw opportunity. He leveraged Lucrezia's Vatican connections to negotiate favorable treaties while showcasing her as Ferrara's cultured first lady, sponsoring artists like Titian to paint her as a radiant benefactor rather than a schemer. The gamble paid off. Ferrara gained papal favor and artistic prestige, while Lucrezia's past dissolved into carefully curated mythology. Even their rebellions were velvet-gloved. When Ferrara's citizens grumbled about taxes, Isabella d'Este, matriarch and cultural powerhouse, didn't send soldiers. She threw public masquerades where nobles and peasants mingled, diffusing tension through spectacle. Meanwhile, her letters to Mantua's Gonzagas and Urbino's Montefeltros wove a web of influence no army could breach. The Este didn't just survive the Renaissance's chaos, they curated it, proving sometimes the quietest power leaves the deepest mark. Flames licked at the feet of Girolamo Savonarola long before the pyre consumed him. The Dominican friar arrived in Florence in 1490, a gaunt figure with burning eyes and a voice like a cracked bell, preaching apocalypse in the city that had birthed the Renaissance. While the Medici bankrolled Botticelli and Michelangelo, Savonarola railed against their decadence, calling Florence a modern Sodom doomed to divine wrath. His sermons at San Marco weren't just speeches, they were exorcisms, stripping away the city's gilded facade to reveal what he saw as the rot beneath. Crowds swarmed to hear him, artisans and nobles alike, their guilt and fear a tinderbox waiting for his spark. What made Savonarola dangerous wasn't his piety, it was his timing. Florence had just watched Lorenzo de' Medici die, leaving his weak-willed son Piero to flounder. When French armies under Charles VIII marched toward Italy in 1494, Piero's cowardly surrender ignited outrage. Savonarola seized the moment, declaring the invasion god's punishment for Medici's sin. As mobs expelled Piero, the friar stepped into the power vacuum, transforming from street corner prophet to the city's de facto ruler. His bonfire of the vanities soon followed a spectacle where Florentines hurled mirrors, cosmetics, even priceless paintings into roaring flames. Botticelli, once a Medici darling, allegedly tossed his own works onto the pyre in terrified repentance. But Savonarola's real nemesis wasn't art, it was economics. His puritanical decrees banned gambling, closed taverns, and criminalized the very luxuries that fueled Florence's economy. Silk weavers and goldsmiths faced ruin, while the poor, whom he'd once championed, grew hungry as trade withered. Worse, he'd alienated Pope Alexander VI by calling him the whore of Babylon in open sermons. When the Pope threatened Florence with excommunication and trade embargoes, merchants who'd cheered Savonarola's rise now whispered of his removal. The end came with brutal irony. After years of condemning others, Savonarola was arrested by the very Florentine Republic he'd helped create. His trial was less about heresy than realpolitik, a chance for the city to appease both the Pope and its restless elite. Under torture, he confessed to fabricated crimes, his broken voice recanting prophecies he'd once sworn were divine. On May 23, 1498, he was hanged with 2 followers in the Piazza della Signoria. Their bodies burned so thoroughly that loyalists couldn't scavenge relics. The ashes were dumped into the Arno, a final insult. No tomb for the man who'd sought to purify Florence, only the river's indifferent current, yet his ghost lingered. Michelangelo, who'd heard Savonarola preach as a young artist, later painted the friar's face into the Sistine Chapel's Last Judgment, an eternal witness to human folly. And Florence, it soon slid back into old habits, the Medici returning within years. But the lesson stuck. In a city where power balanced on a knife's edge, even the voice of God could be silenced if it threatened the ledgers. French boots crunched through alpine snow in 1494, and with them came the beginning of the end for Italy's age of city-states. Charles VIII's invasion wasn't just another medieval war, it was a sledgehammer smashing a delicate ecosystem of power. The young king, barely 24 and fueled by dreams of reclaiming Naples as his Angevin birthright, marched 60,000 men through Italy with shocking ease. Milan's Ludovico Sforza had invited him in, foolishly thinking he could use the French as a pawn against Naples. Instead, Charles's massive artillery train, 40 bronze cannons dragged over mountain passes, showed Italy's warlords a terrifying truth. Their chessboard was now obsolete. Florence's Piero de' Medici set the dominoes falling. Facing the unstoppable French advance, he panicked and handed over key fortresses without a fight, including the vital port of Pisa. Florentines, watching their hard-won territories gifted away, revolted. The Medici were exiled within weeks, their palaces looted. But the real damage was psychological. Italy's richest city had folded like parchment in fire, proving even great republics could collapse overnight when foreign armies loomed. Venice fared better militarily, but bankrupted itself trying to build coalitions against the French. Their desperate payments to German mercenaries and Swiss pikemen drained the treasury dry, forcing the Senate to sell state offices openly. By 1500, even the Council of Ten's feared assassins were taking bribes to ignore corruption. Meanwhile, smaller states like Mantua and Ferrara became glorified toll booths for invading armies, their rulers reduced to hosting lavish banquets for whichever European power marched through that season. The papacy fared worst of all. Alexander VI Borgia first tried to bribe Charles, then fled Rome disguised as a merchant when the French entered. His successor, the warrior Pope Julius II, reversed course allying with France to crush Venice in the War of the League of Cambrai, but Julius's victory poisoned the well. By inviting Spain and Germany into Italy to balance France, he turned the peninsula into a perpetual battleground for Habsburgs and Valois. Internal rot matched external threats. In Florence, Savonarola's fanaticism had shattered civic trust, leaving factions paralyzed. Milan's Sforzas, once masters of realpolitik, wasted their treasury on French and Swiss mercenaries only to see both betray them. Even Venice's famed stability cracked as noble families hoarded wealth, letting the arsenal's shipyards decay while Ottoman fleets grew stronger. The final indignity came in 1527 with the sack of Rome. A bankrupt Holy Roman Emperor could no longer pay his Lutheran mercenaries, so he unleashed them on the Eternal City. For months, German and Spanish troops desecrated churches, tortured cardinals for ransom, and burned priceless manuscripts for warmth. When the smoke cleared, Italy's illusion of independence burned with it. Spain would dominate for centuries, reducing Venice to a tourist curiosity and Florence to a Medici theme park. Yet the city-states didn't just die, they were hollowed out. The same cunning that once built fortunes now served foreign masters. Venetian spies became Habsburg informants, Florentine bankers funded Spanish conquests, and Milan's arms factories outfitted French invaders. The lesson was cruel but clear. In the new age of gunpowder empires, survival meant bending the knee, or becoming someone else's chess piece. Machiavelli never intended The Prince to be a villain's handbook, yet 5 centuries later, its pages still reek of gunpowder and betrayal. Penned in 1513, during his exile from Florence's political whirlwind, the treatise wasn't just theory. It was a dissection of the era's most brutal survivor, Cesare Borgia. The Borgia heir became Machiavelli's living case study, a man who conquered not through divine right but through calculated terror. When Cesare invited disloyal mercenaries to a peace banquet at Sinigalia, only to have them strangled mid-meal, Machiavelli didn't recoil. He took note. Here was power stripped of pretense, where cruelty wasn't a flaw but a tool, and loyalty mattered less than control. What made The Prince so revolutionary wasn't its amorality, but its honesty. Medieval rulers cloaked their violence in chivalry or piety. Machiavelli tore off the mask. His infamous advice, "It is better to be feared than loved," wasn't philosophy. It was forensic analysis. He'd watched Cesare's puppet governor in the Romagna, Ramiro de Orco, brutally pacify the region with executions and severed heads. When the populace seethed with rage, Cesare publicly punished Ramiro, dismembering his own enforcer to appear just. Machiavelli called this well-used cruelty. A ruler, he argued, could slaughter 1,000 today if it prevented 10,000 rebellions tomorrow. The book's genius lay in its cold pragmatism. Machiavelli admired Cesare not for his ruthlessness, but his efficiency. When the Borgia prince seized Urbino by marching troops at dawn during a festival, catching the city defenseless, Machiavelli praised the stunt not as treachery, but as tactical brilliance. Why waste soldiers assaulting walls when distraction could open the gates? Even Cesare's downfall held lessons. His failure to secure papal power before Alexander VI's death proved, to Machiavelli, that fortune favors those who plan for every variable, including their patron's mortality. Yet The Prince wasn't just a Borgia fan letter. It was a survival guide for weak states in a predator's world. Machiavelli's Florence had seen republics toppled by stronger neighbors, mercenaries switching sides, and popes trading souls for territory. His solution, adapt or die. A ruler should be a fox to spot traps and a lion to terrify wolves. He endorsed deception not for its own sake, but because the one who deceives will always find those who let themselves be deceived. The scandal wasn't the advice, it was the audience. Machiavelli didn't whisper these secrets to tyrants in back rooms. He published them, airing Renaissance realpolitik in plain text. Kings banned the book while secretly memorizing its passages. Catherine de Medici reportedly gifted a copy to her son, the future Charles IX of France. Modern dictators still quote it, though they often miss Machiavelli's crucial caveat: terror without purpose is waste. Even Cesare's reign collapsed when his cruelty outran his cunning. Perhaps the darkest irony, Machiavelli wrote The Prince to win favor with Florence's new Medici rulers. They ignored him. The man who laid bare power's mechanics died in obscurity, his masterpiece dismissed as cynical rambling until history proved him right. In the end, The Prince wasn't a call to evil. It was a mirror held up to power's true face, forcing the world to stare at its reflection without flinching. And that, more than any dagger or poison, was what made it dangerous. A Renaissance palace wasn't just a home, it was a stage, every frescoed wall, and gilded statue whispering carefully crafted lies about power. Take Florence's Palazzo Medici, where Benazzo Gozzoli's procession of the Magi fresco transformed a simple family into biblical royalty. Cosimo de' Medici, painted as a wise king offering gifts, knew the value of visual alchemy. Dress a banker in enough sacred imagery, and even his debts looked divine. This wasn't decoration, it was psychological warfare with brushstrokes. Venice took the game further, turning its very architecture into propaganda. The Doge's palace featured a mouth of truth slot where citizens could denounce traitors, but its true purpose was theatrical intimidation. Above it, a sculpture of justice stood blindfolded, her sword pointing toward the chamber where the Council of Ten decided fates. The message, fairness existed, but only if you knelt before the state. Even Titian's portrait of Doge Andrea Gritti showed him gripping an armrest like a throne, though Venice claimed to reject monarchy. Every detail whispered, obey. Milan's Sforza dynasty weaponized art more bluntly. When Francesco Sforza seized power, he commissioned a bronze equestrian statue so massive 24 feet tall that it wasn't just a tribute, it was a physical assertion of dominance over the city skyline. Later, his descendant Ludovico hired Leonardo da Vinci to paint the Last Supper in Santa Maria del Grazie, but also to design festival floats and war machines. The subliminal link, creativity and destruction sprang from the same patron's purse. The papacy perfected celestial branding. Sixtus IV's Sistine Chapel wasn't just a chapel, it was a family album disguised as scripture. Botticelli's Punishment of Cora subtly depicted the Pope's rivals as biblical traitors swallowed by helmets. When Julius II later hired Michelangelo to repaint the ceiling, he insisted on including his own likeness among the prophets. The lesson in Rome, salvation came with a price tag, and God's favor looked suspiciously like nepotism. Even portraits hid daggers in their delicacy. Isabella d'Este's famed Studiolo featured paintings by Mantegna and Perugino showing her as a muse of wisdom, but her real power lay in the letters she wrote from that room, negotiating marriages and alliances across Europe. Meanwhile, Federico da Montefeltro's iconic profile portrait, with its missing nasal bridge, a tournament injury, turned disfigurement into a badge of martial honor. These weren't vanity projects, they were visual treaties, asserting legitimacy in a world where bloodlines were often murkier than paint. The darkest irony. Many masterpieces we admire today began as weapons. Botticelli's Primavera, commissioned by Lorenzo de' Medici, wasn't just a celebration of spring, it was a threat. The central figure of Mercury, touching clouds with his caduceus, echoed Lorenzo's own role as a political weathermaker, capable of summoning storms or sunshine for his enemies. Art didn't reflect power in Renaissance Italy, it laundered it, turning coercion into something beautiful enough to hang on a chapel wall. And that's why these works still mesmerize us centuries later, not just for their beauty, but for the audacity of their lies. The vial of Cantarella slipped into the wine was less a weapon than a promise, a whispered guarantee that in Renaissance Italy, even feasts could be fatal. The Borgias loom large in popular imagination as the poisoners of history, their names synonymous with rings that dispensed lethal drops and banquets where guests collapsed mid-toast. But peel back the layers of myth, and you'll find a far more intriguing reality. The family's true poison wasn't arsenic, but perception. Contemporary accounts of Borgia murders read like sensational fiction. Take the infamous 1503 banquet where Alexander VI and Caesar allegedly intended to poison several cardinals. According to legend, they miscalculated the dosage, accidentally killing their own guest, while the targets walked away unscathed. Yet no primary sources confirm this tale. The earliest mention appears decades later in anti-Borgia pamphlets, likely propaganda by rivals like Cardinal Della Rover. Even the notorious Poisoned Ring story, where Lucrezia supposedly dispatched enemies with a twist of her jewelry, traces back to a single satirical poem by a disgruntled Ferrer's courtier. What's often overlooked is the very real science of Renaissance toxicity. Apothecaries kept detailed records of aconite, arsenic, and hemlock compounds, often labeling them with euphemisms like special sugar or sleeping powder. Venice's state archives contain recipes for slow-acting poisons designed to mimic consumption, while Milanese physicians experimented with Cantarella, a rumored Borgia favorite made from decomposed swine entrails, which could induce symptoms resembling natural fevers. The difference, these weren't tools of personal vendetta, but statecraft. When the Duke of Gandia, Alexander's own son, was found floating in the Tiber with 9 stab wounds in 1497, no poison was involved. The murder's brutality suggests a political hit, not clandestine chemistry. The Borgias didn't need literal poison to terrify. Their power lay in the uncertainty they cultivated. By letting rumors of their toxicity flourish, they turned every dinner invitation into a test of loyalty. When Cardinal Orsini died in prison after opposing Caesar, the official cause was apoplexy, but the whispers did more damage than any toxin. Likewise, Alexander's sudden 1503 death, likely from malaria, spawned endless theories of accidental self-poisoning or divine retribution. obscuring the fact that Renaissance medicine killed more popes than any conspiracy. Perhaps the most telling evidence against the Borgia poison myth is their downfall. If they'd truly mastered undetectable assassination, why did Caesar collapse politically the moment his father died? Why did Lucrezia spend her final years as a pious duchess, not a serial killer? The answer lies in the nature of Renaissance power. Reputation was deadlier than any vial. By becoming the monsters their enemies needed them to be, the Borgias achieved something darker than murder. They became legends, their crimes magnified to justify others' ambitions. 5 centuries later, we still can't look away. Not because they were history's greatest villains, but because they understood the first rule of power. Sometimes, the myth is more useful than the truth. The ruthless calculus of Renaissance power didn't fade with the last Medici banker, or the final whisper of a Venetian spy. It simply put on a modern suit. Every backroom deal in today's geopolitics, every carefully leaked scandal, every smiling handshake hiding mutual contempt carries the DNA of those Italian city-states. Consider Vladimir Putin's playbook in Crimea. Just as Caesar Borgia used proxies to destabilize rivals before moving in, Russia deployed little green men without insignias to seize territory while maintaining plausible deniability. The tactics are identical, only the weapons have upgraded from daggers to social media bots. Media manipulation. The Borgias would blush at how tame their poison pen letters seem compared to Cambridge Analytica's data harvesting. Where Lorenzo de' Medici commissioned frescoes to burnish his image, modern politicians stage viral photo ops with puppies and tanks. The Venetians mastered information warfare with their black chambers intercepted letters. Today's equivalents are NSA surveillance programs and hacked emails splashed across WikiLeaks. Even the Renaissance practice of bankrupting rivals through engineered debt crises finds its echo in Wall Street short sellers tanking currencies, or hedge funds squeezing national economies. Corporate espionage owes its playbook to Sienna's silk merchants, who stole dye formulas from Constantinople. Modern tech giants sue over stolen algorithms with the same fury as 15th-century glassmakers chasing Murano's defectors. And when oligarchs stash wealth in offshore accounts, they're channeling the Medici's shadow ledgers, just with Cayman Islands shell companies, instead of coded entries in a Florentine bank book. The darkest parallel lies in the weaponization of chaos. Machiavelli observed that a leader must sometimes play the fox to survive. Today's strongmen manufacture crises to consolidate power. Turkey's Erdogan staging a coup to purge enemies' mirrors, how the Sforzas fabricated rebellions to justify martial law. Hungary's Orbán controlling 90% of media mirrors, how Cosimo de' Medici bought up Florence's scribes and printers. Yet the most enduring lesson isn't in the tactics, it's in the mindset. Renaissance rulers understood that power isn't about morality, but motion. Like chess players sacrificing pawns, they made cold calculations. Is this assassination worth the backlash? Will this betrayal buy 10 years of advantage? Modern politicians still make these trades daily, sanctioning allies, abandoning principles, all while maintaining the fiction of benevolence. The gilded frames may have changed, but the painting remains. Power doesn't evolve. It just finds new costumes. Caterina Sforza's legend paints her as a lioness in armor, the woman who, when enemies threatened her children, allegedly lifted her skirts on the ramparts of Ravaldino Castle and shouted, "I have the means to make more." But how much of this defiance was real, and how much was crafted by admirers and enemies alike? The archival record is tantalizingly vague. Contemporary chronicles mention her stubborn defense of Forli, yet the infamous gesture only appears in writings decades later. Was it battlefield bravado, or did later historians embellish the story to fit Renaissance ideals of ruthless maternity? Even her famed poison garden, where she supposedly cultivated toxic plants for political convenience, leaves more questions than answers. Apothecary receipts list henbane and hemlock, but were these for medicine or murder? The line between fact and folklore blurs, leaving us to wonder, did Caterina weaponize her reputation as deliberately as she wielded a dagger? Then there's the Medici poison paradox. Court records from Florence's archives whisper of suspicious deaths, opponents succumbing to sudden fevers, after dining at Medici palazzos, the most infamous case. Francesco de' Pazzi's final meal with Lorenzo the Magnificent in 1478, hours before the infamous assassination plot, Francesco was dead within days, his body erupting in sores. Physicians called it plague, but the timing was convenient. Modern toxicologists note that arsenic, then tasteless when mixed with wine, could mimic such symptoms. Yet without exhumations or residue tests, proof remains as elusive as a shadow in the Palazzo Pitti. Even the Medici's own kin weren't immune. Giovanni di Pierfrancesco, a rival branch heir, perished abruptly in 1498 after clashing with Lorenzo's son. Coincidence, or a chilling reminder that in Renaissance Florence, inconvenient relatives had a habit of expiring mid-meal? The riddles multiply when we turn to Venice's Council of Ten. Their archives, deliberately burned during Napoleon's invasion, left only fragments of cases like the Night of the Black Masks in 1522, when 3 senators vanished mid-deliberation. Were they silenced for opposing a secret war with the Ottomans, or was their disappearance staged to cover embezzlement? The lone surviving note, scribbled by a junior clerk, cryptically mentions the Well of Silence, likely a dungeon beneath the Doge's palace, though no human remains have ever been found there. Perhaps the most haunting enigma belongs to Lucrezia Borgia's fourth husband, Alfonso d'Este. After years of stability, he began suffering seizures in 1518, dying in agony. Rumors swirled that Lucrezia, tired of his interference in her political machinations, had resorted to the family's favorite recipe. But Vatican physicians blamed syphilis, while Ferrara's court blamed Venetian spies. Centuries later, historians uncovered a letter from Alfonso's sister, describing how he'd started refusing meals from any kitchen but his own, a man who clearly suspected his plate was a battleground. These unanswered questions do more than tease, they reveal the Renaissance's beating heart. In an era where power balanced on deception, ambiguity itself was a weapon. A ruler could let rumors of poison do the work of actual toxins, or allow a defiant legend to deter enemies better than any army. The mysteries persist not because history forgot the answers, but because those who lived them knew. Sometimes, the most powerful truth is the one left hanging in the air, like the scent of bitter almonds in a wine cup, unprovable, unforgettable, and utterly lethal to reputations. Behind the gilded facade of Renaissance Italy, the city-states built empires not just on marble and gold, but on a far sharper currency, calculated ruthlessness wrapped in velvet. Florence's Medici masked tyranny with patronage, Venice cloaked its terror in legal pageantry, and Milan's Sforzas turned betrayal into a dynastic art form. These weren't just governments, they were masterclasses in human ambition, proving that power thrives where others see chaos. The irony, their greatest legacy isn't in the battles they won or the palaces they built, but in the uncomfortable truth they laid bare. Civilization often advances on the back of cunning as much as virtue. Consider the paradoxes. The same Venetian councils that drowned traitors in moonlit canals also pioneered democratic safeguards against tyranny. Machiavelli's cold-blooded prince was penned by a man who adored republics. Even Savonarola's bonfires of vanity, for all their zealotry, forced Florence to confront its own excess. These contradictions are the heartbeat of history, reminding us that progress isn't a straight line, but a crooked path walked by flawed giants. So the next time you stroll through Florence's Piazza della Signoria or gaze at Titian's portraits in Venice, look closer. Those frescoes and statues aren't just art, they're frozen battles in a war of perception. The past isn't a morality play, it's a blood-soaked thriller where the heroes and villains wear the same jeweled gloves, and that's what makes it thrilling. Now it's your turn to judge. Would you gamble on Lorenzo de' Medici's silver tongue, or trust Cesare Borgia's dagger? Could you outmaneuver the Council of Ten, or would their whispers send you sinking into the lagoon? The chessboard is set. The pieces are moving. Comment below with the Renaissance ruler you'd follow or flee.